Welcome. We are talking about this week's Torah portion, which is actually a double portion, which is Nitzavim-Vayelekh. And we are getting really close to the end of the book of Deuteronomy, like really, really close to the end. Moses is giving farewell addresses, final words, and we only have, because the following week is going to be Rosh Hashanah, and so we're really getting down to the end of it. We don't really have much left. And speaking about not much left, neither does Moses. Now, if I were to ask you, Deb, it's a good thing that you're here so I can ask you questions rather than just me asking the camera questions, which is, what sort of the human lifespan? What would you say? What is it? Years.
What do you mean?
How many
The
years do
age?
people live? Yeah.
Then or now?
Yes.
Which way do you?
Both. Either.
Okay, now the average lifespan is about 75 here in the United States.
Okay.
And back then, the way they measured things was completely different. So I don't know. They say that Moses was very old. So I want to guess they thought he was like 700 years old. I don't know how old he really was.
So it's interesting when we think of what, years, how old people are in the Bible. So we do have in the early part of the book of Genesis, we do have these people who are living hundreds and hundreds of years. I think the highest number we see is 900 something. And there's, 300, it's crazy, 600 years. They're living a long time. But that's in the early part of the book of Genesis. But then we see something change. And actually for this, I'm going to do a little screen share, which is this. When it's actually in Genesis 6. What we see is when people began to increase on earth and daughters were born to them, the divine beings the divine being saw how beautiful the daughters of men were and took wives from among those that pleased them. And then the Lord said, my breath shall not abide in man forever, since he too is flesh. Let the days allowed him be 120 years. Okay. And then it continues, it was then and later too that the Nephilim appeared on earth when the divine, okay, this is going off in a totally different direction. But here, basically, we see 6th chapter of Genesis. The first 5 chapters of Genesis, as we just mentioned, people were living hundreds and hundreds of years. They were living a long, long, long time. But then, as Genesis says, God comes in and says, I got to cut it off. 120, we're not going to, I can't let people live for centuries. So, in a sense, there is, they did have some crazy counting, whatever that was. But then God stepped in and said, this can't go on. I'm capping it at 120, right? Now, the reason I mention this, even though it will be coming up in just a matter of weeks, Genesis 6, as far as our Torah portion, so that is on the horizon, but I'm not mentioning it because of that. I'm actually mentioning it because of something in this week's Torah portion. So I mentioned that Moses, and actually, before I go back, it's really fascinating, Deb, you mentioned the average lifespan now in America, right? So it's interesting when we think of like oldest people living, because I think the oldest person alive is maybe 117 years old now, maybe give or take a year or two. So that's getting close to that 120. And apparently the oldest person to live, as far as we know, at least in recent, millennia, as it were, is a lady named Jean Calment, who died at 122 years old in 1997. So 122, that's pretty close to 120, right? We're at 117 for the oldest person living. So also we're in that range of 120-ish, give or take a couple of years. So that's not entirely fantastical like we saw in the first 5 chapters of the book of Genesis. And really the rest of the Bible, we don't see these crazy centuries old people. They really, it's it's 120 or less for the most part. Okay, I mention all this because we've got in this week's Torah portion, we have one of the things that Moses says. So I mentioned at the outset, this is actually a double portion. So we got Nitzavim and Vayelekh, and we have in the very beginning of the Vayelekh, and the second portion of the second half of this week's Torah portion. So Moses went and spoke all these things to Israel in chapter 31 of Deuteronomy, and he said to them, I am 120 years old today, and I am just no longer able to just go out and come back. And actually also the Lord has told me, you shall not cross this Jordan River. Okay, the Lord your God himself will cross over before you, and he himself will wipe those nations out from before your path, and you shall dispossess them. And Joshua is the one who shall cross before you, as the Lord has spoken. And so Moses here is already talking about a succession plan. He already knows he says, look, I'm done. I'm 120 years old. I've lived a life. I've lived a full life. I've done a lot in my life, and I just can't do it anymore. I just can no longer physically, emotionally, mentally, intellectually, spiritually. I'm done. I'm finished. And I'm also coming up, I'm hitting a ceiling, as it were, even though it's more of a horizontal than a vertical ceiling, but I just can't cross this river. God's already told me that. That's literally a life limit. I can't cross this river. We're very close to crossing over. And if you as a nation are worried, don't worry, because Joshua over here, he'll guide you across. So it's amusing to me in thinking about this, that we have Moses here saying, I've hit my limit. I've hit my limit both in a geographical sense, right? Because God's already told me you can't cross that river, and he's pretty close to it, bringing the people, and they're not just going to stay there forever because they have the promised land to get to across the river. But also, he knows he's hit his his time limit, as it were, on this earth, which is for me, it's fascinating that but we do hear it sometimes. Even here, we hear people saying, I'm done. Right? I don't know if you've ever heard anybody articulating that to you. I've lived X amount of years. I have, whether I have grandkids, great grandkids or not, like I've lived my life. I don't have it within me anymore. And right? Have you heard that?
Yes, I have.
Yeah. Yeah. And so that's something that, I'll be honest, I was really, before I came here a few months ago, I've never heard that. I never heard that before. So being here, it's something that I've heard a few times, and ultimately people, they spent their time here and they're ready to move on. And it's an interesting admission, because I think oftentimes in our culture, people don't want to talk about death. They don't even think about no longer being here, or no longer having whatever it is to either enjoy or do or experience. It's just not even something that's even on their radar. But here Moses is admitting, he says, look, I've done a lot. I've also spent 40 years dealing with you Jews, again, who are contentious and stiff-necked people. So that's tough enough as it is. But and so imagine that. He spent his first 80 years doing all sorts of stuff, in the last 40, we're dealing with them. It's a lot. So one of the things that I actually recently came across in thinking about the 120 thing is this. There's an expression that's often said that I've heard, which is until 120, or may you live to be 120, or certainly a sense that may you live to be 120. Have you ever heard that before?
Mm-hmm.
Expression, yeah. So
yes, I have.
That's great. So there's an article that actually came out this summer that talked about this expression, which I never thought about fully before. And knowing what we had seen in Genesis chapter 6 about God saying, I'm just capping human lives up to 120, and what we just saw in this week's Torah portion about Moses saying, I've hit my 120. there's a really fascinating thinking about this in a historical sense. So we have, I'm just going to highlight it here. Okay, let's see if I can do, okay, so we have, I'm just going to do this right here. So this blessing of until 120, Ad Mea V'Esrim Shana, where did it come from? In truth, 120 is already a long life for most people, no matter, and by the way, that doesn't matter the century, it doesn't matter the country, the culture, etc. That's a long time to live. And it's interesting because this article quotes the book of Isaiah saying the youngest shall die 100 years old. It was already really old, and but here's the kicker. Here's what's really great. A long life was always viewed as a blessing from God. Both the Torah and the Talmud, the rabbis of the Talmud, suggest in many places that the reward for following the commandments, both in general and very specific aspects, is long life. The tradition of blessing a person to live to 120 years as a way of wishing someone long life only began in the last few hundred years. The term Ad Mea V'Esrim, or until 120, appears in responsive literature, so answering various questions, from the 18th century through the present. There's no evidence of the phrase being used in earlier times. So I was really surprised by this, because I think this is a fairly commonly spoken, now granted, it's been with us a few centuries, and it's funny when we think about time, because when we talk about centuries, for us, that's a long time for something to be ingrained in a culture. But I think within the broader perspective or broader spectrum of Jewish life, Jewish literature, Jewish wisdom, it's a tiny fraction of it. So I was surprised by that. Now, I do want to mention that there is, when we think about sort of the length of life, there is in the Pirkei Avot, have I mentioned that here before? Pirkei Avot? So there is a rabbinic collection of wisdom, of sayings called Pirkei Avot, and it's from rabbis in the early centuries of the Common Era, and some even that were before the Common Era. And one of the sayings is actually from a sage named Yehuda ben Tema, Yehuda the son of Tema, and he goes through and talks about different milestones in people's lives. I really wanted to point out this, which is a really interesting rabbinic text of Yehuda ben Tema and his statement as to these different sort of ages. And I will point out right away, I think one of the most notable things about it is that it is very gendered. It's very masculine. It's very focused on a man's life and not a woman's life. So that's just something to consider. I will say two further things. One is, it doesn't mean that this is the only and the authoritative text on different ages, although I think since there's nothing really that goes against it, it sort of is de facto and understood as sort of a general conceptual way of thinking about a man's life. And the totally separate thing, the second thing is, we don't know what sort of corresponding feminine gendered sort of timeline might look like in the rabbinic mind, or even for the women at the time. In the absence of those, we'll just work with this, which is, he talks about these different ages and especially going to different decades. So he talks about, for instance, at 40, there's discernment. At 50, there's sort of wisdom dispensing. At 60, you get to old age. At 70 years old, you get to, it's not really clear, but some sort of different elderliness. At 80, it says strength, although one suspects that strength might be a euphemism, right, for lack of strength. At 90, it's some sort of maybe a bent body or sort of out to pasture. And then at 100, which is a really, I think, a very blunt and sort of shocking expression, which is at 100 years old, is if this person has died and they've passed and they're no longer in this world, even though they clearly are still in this world, but it is if they're really not still really with us. I think that's a shocking.
Now, where is that?
This is,
Where is it on? I can see at 90 a bent body, at 100 as good as dead and gone, completely out of the world.
yes.
Now, where are you?
Yeah, that.
Is that what you're talking about?
Yep, that's exactly what I'm talking about. It's a very blunt language.
As good as dead.
What?
Yeah,
It's
as good
very
as
blunt.
dead.
As good as dead, right? It's very blunt language
Yeah,
for sure.
yeah,
Which might
I
even
agree.
it's not very PC, as it were. It's just
No,
out there.
not at all.
Not at all PC. But I think one of the striking things about I mean, yes, it's interesting about the 70, the 80, and really once 60 and 70 are already old, and then 80 and 90 and 100, it just goes down from there as far as abilities. Now, for me, what's really shocking, what's really, in addition to actually what's going on in that text, what's really fascinating is it really doesn't account for beyond 100, right? Because we already have this blessing of until 120, or this sort of notion of human capability to achieve the age of 120. And yet this text really, once you hit 100, you're sort of out of the game, as it were, right? It doesn't try to count up to 110, doesn't try to count up to 120.
Why do they say you're dead at 100?
So I think this sage, and it's also interesting when we think about him. He doesn't have the name. He doesn't have the title rabbi, but he's included in this sort of grouping of rabbinic wisdom. So his name is Yehuda ben Tema. No rabbi,
Right.
rabbi, but it he doesn't go all the way up to 120, which is interesting. I think
No.
maybe what he's saying, and he's probably just reflecting what he sees around him as far as this is what he's observed. And really, maybe in his time, people really aren't living beyond 100, right? Even though he understands and he's read these texts from the Torah, from both Genesis and Deuteronomy, he's aware of them. He knows that sort of God sort of caps human length of existence at 120-ish. Nevertheless, he maybe observes in his time where he's living that 100 is really kind of it. Like, people can live past 100. He's definitely acknowledging that. But it's sort of, he's saying, look, there's a notable decline at 80, at 90, and really 100, they're just not part of everybody else as they once were, which is, again, shocking. It's a blunt thing to say, as opposed to nowadays, it could be we have better nutrition, understand more about the body. People can, do different things and certainly live more or longer. But it's funny because I know what you mentioned, thinking about the outset, when we think about, way back in the day in the Bible times, they were all living for centuries. And yet it really was just sort of the beginning of human existence, at least as the Torah puts it in the first 5 chapters of Genesis. And then from the 6th chapter on, it really changes where it's capped out at 120. And also, it's not as if we see, as far as I can remember, and I can be wrong on this point, but I don't remember a lot of other people in the Bible really living that much beyond 100 even. I could be wrong. I haven't done a full study of the ages, at least the ages of people in the Bible when they died. I'm sure, you never know. And it could be one of those things that there could be exceptions. There could be someone who somehow managed to live 140 years. I'm not an expert
Well,
in this area.
I should ask Alexa.
Yeah.
What the oldest person in the Bible is.
Yeah.
She'd know.
Yeah. Maybe as a part 2. This could be a part 2 of the series. Maybe when we get to that in Genesis chapter 6, it could be a part 2. This would be the introduction, and that would be a part 2 of like looking at all the different people and how long they lived. Yeah, that'd be really, I think, a further, in-depth study. I do want to one thing I do want to note, which is I think following up on this 120 years sort of thing, is that so Moses says, I'm 120. I'm done. I don't have much else to live. There are a few rabbis who actually the Talmud describes as having lived, I just want to find it really quickly. I have notes. Okay. There are 3 rabbis that the Talmud actually states lived to be 120. I don't know how much of that was sort of a literary flourish, that they didn't really live to be 120. It just, like, maybe they could have lived for 100 years or 112, and it just rounds up to 120 literarily, or maybe they literally did live for 120 years. But these 3 rabbis are at least rabbinic figures. So one was Hillel HaZaken, Hillel. So when we talk about Beit Hillel, this is the academy that Hillel founded. So Hillel, who lived around the turn of basically 2 millennia ago, I'm sorry. Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. So Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai sort of provided continuity from when the temple was destroyed, the second temple in 70 of the Common Era when it was destroyed. So he helped carry the rabbinic traditions after the destruction of the temple. And the third is Rabbi Akiva. And he died in the 130s of the Common Era. So all 3 of these significant leaders of the Jewish people, or Rabbi Akiva wasn't necessarily a leader, but he was definitely a significant rabbinic and intellectual leader. So but at the same time, it's not like they were common. Not a lot of rabbis were noted to have lived to 120. It was just like these 3 are pointed out as having lived that lengthily. Ultimately, I think it's a really fascinating. I mean, look, we can still use this expression, this phrase, may you live to be 120 years old. I think it's also something to note that it's not something that dates back to antiquity. It's something of a more recent vintage in the last 3 centuries that we've been using now in Jewish culture.
Good.
Yeah. Do you have any?
I'm glad to know the background of it.
Yeah.
Background of it. Because I grew up with that.
Oh, yeah.
And I didn't know where it was coming from.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So Genesis 6, and it may be, like I said, maybe that would be fun, especially in thinking about when we get to Genesis, and we have to start the Torah reading all over again and contextualizing what happens in those first 5 chapters as to all those people living so long, and how to make sense of that.
What do you suppose is going to happen when medical science advances the age to normal life expectancy to be 120, 125?
I don't know.
Because that's right on the cusp of happening.
Be really fascinating. I don't know enough about medicine, and I'm not much of a futurist or a technologist, but it should be, to be honest, I think maybe doctors might be better able to answer this question. I'm curious myself to see how how it goes, and I know a lot of people talk about lengthening lives.
In your lifetime, you will see that. It's already advanced to 85 to 95. So in my lifetime, I won't see that, but you probably will.
Mm-hmm.
So it'll be interesting to see.
It will be interesting to see. We'll see what happens when it happens. But yeah, we'll see how much life changes, or I think, and not just in the individual level, I think societally things might also adapt. Mm-hmm. A lot of the people are living much longer. I know I've come across in previous things I've read that, especially earlier in this century or in previous centuries in Europe, the life expectancy was a lot shorter, right? And so the way that the society mm-hmm. structured and various activities and the way that people thought about different things, or even kids, was so much different than it is now. And so I don't know what it would be like in the future if that still continues to go even higher. I mean, some places it's like, what, in the mid-30s, your life expectancy, your 40s. So if we're doubling and tripling that, it could be, really fascinating. I don't know what to expect. What I took out from this week's Torah portion was from chapter 31 here, which is Moses saying, I am 120 years old. I can no longer go out and come in. right? In this English translation, I can no longer be active. And also God said to me, I can't cross the Jordan. So this is from this week's Torah portion. This is what I really wanted to focus on and explore from there. All right. Well, thank you so much, Debbie. This is really great. And Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you too.
All right.
Bye
Okay.
to you all week long.
Thank you. All right.